My mother's laughter felt like shrapnel, but 32-year-old Aisha Pendleton doesn't flinch. They thought I inherited nothing more than a worthless piece of paper, until every broadcast in America told them I was a hero. My family didn't just lose an estate. They triggered a digital execution they never saw coming. My silence wasn't weakness. It was a tactical countdown to their total destruction. But before the sirens, the Secret Service, and the national salute, there was the suffocating weight of a memory that still tastes like betrayal. The air in that room was a trap, and I was the only one who knew the trigger had already been pulled. The grand library of the Pendleton estate smelled of old mahogany, expensive whiskey, and the cold, clinical scent of predatory anticipation. Outside, the DC autumn sky was a bruised purple, pressing a heavy mist against the tall windows. I stood at the very back of the room, my navy dress uniform feeling like a second skin, its crisp lines a sharp contrast to the flowing silks and relaxed, arrogant silhouettes of the guests. 400 of Washington's elite, lobbyists, socialites, and power brokers, filled the space, their whispers clinking like ice in crystal glasses. They were silent judges, waiting to see how the Pendleton empire would be carved up. Looking back now, I should have seen the betrayal coming, but I chose to believe in the dignity of blood. Malvina Pendleton, my mother, commanded the room from a velvet wingback chair, her expression a perfectly manufactured mask of grief. She didn't look at me once. Her focus remained entirely on the thick legal folders held by the family attorney, making it clear to everyone that I was a ghost in my own lineage. My siblings, Cressida and Sterling, leaned against the bookshelves with a smug air of ownership, already measuring the room for their own ambitions. True strength isn't found in the roar of the lion, but in the stillness of the mountain that remains after the storm has passed. My grandfather Alaric taught me that. I felt the sting of my family's erasure, but I refused to let my knuckles whiten. The attorney began the long, rhythmic reading of distributions. The Georgetown mansion went to Sterling, the offshore portfolios and the Virginia Hunt Club to Cressida. Millions of dollars in liquid assets were partitioned with surgical precision. As the minutes ticked by, my name remained unspoken, heightening the collective sense of my failure among the watchful crowd. Have you ever stood in a room full of people and felt completely invisible? It is a unique kind of pain when your whole life is judged by the size of a bank account you never asked for. I didn't realize it then, but this calculated silence was the opening move in a war they had already planned. "And finally," Malvina said, her voice cutting through the library's stillness like a jagged blade. She stood up, reaching for a small, thin red envelope resting on the silver tray. All 400 guests leaned in, the air thick with a cruel, expectant energy. "To Aisha, our youngest," she began, a predatory smile playing on her lips. "Your grandfather leaves this. Guess he didn't love you much, sweetheart." She tossed the envelope toward me. It fluttered through the air, looking pathetic and fragile compared to the heavy deeds my siblings held. While they inherited the legacy of a titan, I had been handed what appeared to be a scrap of paper. Cressida snickered loudly, ensuring her socialite friends witnessed my supposed humiliation. "The gluttonous hippo finally gets her pittance," she whispered, her words sparking a wave of polite but venomous laughter that rippled through the hall. I processed the sound as tactical battlefield noise, a distraction meant to break my focus. Character is how you treat those who can do absolutely nothing for you. In that moment, my mother revealed she had none. I stepped forward with steady hands and took the envelope. I thanked the attorney with professional dignity, my gaze remaining as calm as a deep ocean. On the surface, my siblings had won the tangible world, but they were blinded by their own greed. They followed the law of the dollar, overlooking the specific, hand-delivered clause, stamped on the corner of my red paper. My Navy-trained eyes caught the subtle, raised watermark of the Department of Defense beneath the crimson dye. I felt a surge of quiet pity for them. They were fighting over the scraps of a dying world while I was holding something far more dangerous than money. Looking at them now, I realized that some people are so poor that all they have is their wealth. That's where the real story started. I walked through the crowd, the laughter following me like shrapnel. I didn't rush my exit. I maintained the slow, disciplined stride of an officer leaving a briefing. The lobbyists moved aside, their faces a blur of condescension, but I didn't care. Being disowned by a corrupt family is the first step toward true freedom, and I could feel the tether to their poison finally snapping. Legacy isn't about what is kept in a bank, but what is kept in the soul. Alaric's love was never meant to be a bribe for my loyalty. It was a shield for my integrity. Alone in the shadowed foyer, I ran my fingers along the edge of the red paper. My siblings were already arguing over the mansion's floor plans in the other room, their voices rising in a frantic, ugly competition. They are fighting over the cage, while I have been given the key to the sky. I realized then that this empty gift was a test of my readiness for a mission they couldn't even imagine. My heart beat with a steady, anticipatory pulse as I stepped out into the cold Georgetown rain. The water felt clean, washing away the scent of the library's rot. As I reached my car, my phone vibrated with a sharp, encrypted notification. I opened the red envelope, pulling out a transparent slip of plastic that felt like glass. A single, glowing QR code sat in the center, and beneath it, 3 words were written in Alaric's firm, military hand: "Report to the kennel." I watched the raindrops bead on the red paper, the digital code reflecting in my eyes like a distant fire. The cold Georgetown rain began to seep through my uniform, but the chill outside was nothing compared to the clinical frost radiating from the dining hall. Malvina had convened a victory dinner to celebrate the carving of the Pendleton estate, and the scent of prime rib and expensive Bordeaux drifted through the corridors like a taunt. I paused in the doorway, my boots silent on the polished hardwood, and observed the spectacle. Sterling and Cressida were already seated, their faces flushed with the adrenaline of new wealth, while the staff moved with rehearsed precision. Have you ever entered a room only to realize that the space meant for you has been systematically filled with shadows? It is a quiet form of execution when your own mother looks through you, as if you were made of glass. "Aisha, you're still here?" Malvina's voice cut through the clink of silver, sharp and devoid of warmth. I noticed immediately that my place setting was conspicuously absent. In its place sat a decorative vase of lilies, their white petals looking like funeral shrouds. My siblings didn't even look up from their appetizers. Those who contribute nothing to the family legacy do not deserve a seat at its table, she added, her eyes meeting mine with a terrifying clarity. I didn't beg for a chair or argue the legality of my exclusion. A full stomach often leads to a dull mind, but a hungry soul sees the truth through the walls. Grandpa Alaric taught me that, and tonight, the walls were starting to look very thin. I turned away from the warmth of the hall and walked out into the damp garden, the darkness swallowing the distant hum of their laughter. The air smelled of wet earth and ancient cedar as I made my way toward the estate's kennels. Rex, Alaric's aging German shepherd, greeted me with a low, rhythmic wag of his tail, his eyes reflecting the pale moonlight. I sat on the straw-covered floor and pulled a dry piece of sourdough from my pocket, sharing it with the only creature on this property that still recognized my scent. They think they've taken my portion, but they've only freed me from their poison. In that moment of profound isolation, I found a peace that their vintage wine could never provide. Following the cryptic instruction from the red envelope, I ran my fingers along Rex's old brass collar. My Navy cryptology training took over, my senses sharpening despite the hollow ache in my chest. Hidden beneath the heavy buckle, I felt a series of microscopic ridges that didn't belong to the original craftsmanship. It was a 12-digit alphanumeric key, etched with such surgical precision that only someone looking for a hidden frequency would ever find it. I realized then that the empty red envelope was never a pittance. It was a tactical filter designed to be ignored by the greedy and understood only by a soldier. Alaric's hand was reaching across the grave, guiding me toward a battlefield my siblings couldn't even see. I opened my secure military laptop in the dim, amber light of the dog kennel, the screen casting long shadows on the wooden beams. The Pendleton family had spent decades chasing ghosts and trophies, never realizing that the general had hidden the real gold in the most unassuming places. Honor is not a title bestowed by the living. It is a duty passed down from those who know the value of the land we stand on. I was no longer the forgotten girl eating bread in the darkness. I was a lieutenant on duty. The transition from grief to reason was instantaneous, my fingers gliding across the keys as I prepared to enter the code that would change everything. Inside the mansion, the greed-driven machinery of my siblings was already grinding toward disaster. I could see the flickering lights through the trees as Sterling, obsessed with the blank slip of paper he'd snatched earlier, attempted to force his way into what he believed was a digital fortune. He was using a black market decryption tool, a crude hammer against a lock he didn't understand. He didn't realize that I had left a honeypot protocol in that slip, a digital trap designed to trigger at the first sign of unauthorized entry. Have you ever watched someone destroy themselves because they were too busy trying to steal what they never earned? It is a spectacle of poetic justice that requires no intervention. The cinematic silence of the night was suddenly shattered by the muffled sound of a surge protector blowing inside the house. In a heartbeat, the estate's high-speed fiber lines went dark, the security cameras drooping like dead eyes. All Pendleton corporate accounts, LLCs, and Sterling's personal devices were instantly hit by a Tier 1 federal asset review lock. They had accidentally triggered a national security protocol, locking themselves out of their own stolen fortune by trying to prey on my supposed pittance. The screams of frustration from the dining hall drifted across the lawn, hollow and powerless against the digital wall they had built for themselves. My screen in the cell remained a steady, tranquil blue, unaffected by the chaos in the main house. A single message appeared in white letters. Protocol initiated. Welcome back, Lieutenant. I felt the weight of the name Pendleton transform into a sharp, powerful affirmation as the system recognized my access. The battle had officially shifted from the dining table to the server room, and for the first time, the odds were in my favor. Looking back now, it was the moment I realized that silence wasn't just the absence of noise. It was preparation for attack. I didn't know what the next hour would bring, but I was ready to operate in the shadows. I watched the red lights of the estate's backup security system blink out, leaving my family screaming in the total darkness of their own making. My own screen displayed a glowing map of the truth they had tried so hard to bury, a trail of wire transfers and hidden accounts that led directly to the heart of their rot. I closed the laptop, my heart beating with the slow, disciplined rhythm of a counteroffensive. I didn't realize it then, but the darkness was my greatest ally. As I stood up to face the house, I knew that the silence of the Pendleton estate was about to be broken by a truth they couldn't bribe or ignore. The silence of the Pendleton estate had become heavy, a physical weight pressing against the glass of the conservatory. While Sterling and Cressida's muffled shrieks echoed from the far wing, desperate attempts to bully the IT staff into fixing their digital ruin, the air around me remained eerily still. I sat in the darkness of the conservatory, surrounded by the exotic, shadowed silhouettes of tropical plants that had seen generations of Pendleton secrets. The only light came from the flickering emergency candles, their flames dancing like nervous ghosts in the humid air. That was when Malvina entered. She didn't march in with her usual aristocratic thunder. Instead, she moved with a honeyed, terrifying kindness that made the hair on my arms stand up. "Aisha, dear, you must be exhausted," she whispered, her voice a soft purr that felt like silk over a razor blade. She carried a delicate porcelain cup, the steam from the tea curling upward in the candlelight. She began to speak of the heavy burdens of being a Pendleton mother, weaving a narrative of misunderstandings and family stress. I watched her hands. They were trembling, but not with the tremor of a grieving mother. It was the frantic adrenaline of a predator who had lost the scent and was trying one last, desperate lure. A mother's love should be the sanctuary of the soul, but when it becomes a transaction, it is the most dangerous debt in the world. I remained silent, letting the vacuum of her words reveal the hollow desperation beneath. She wasn't seeking my forgiveness. She was hunting the 12-digit key she knew I had found. My Navy counterintelligence training had taught me to look for the things people tried to hide in plain sight. As she set the tea down on the glass table, I noticed a slight, oily sheen on the surface of the amber liquid. Malvina's eyes flickered toward the cup, then away, avoiding my gaze with a sudden, unnatural intensity. My internal red alert screamed. I recognized that faint chemical sweetness, a high-grade sedative from the family's private medical stash. It was the Pendleton way of negotiating. If you can't buy them, break them. I didn't accuse her. I didn't flinch. Looking back now, I realized that the last shred of my childhood hope died in that conservatory. "Mother, could you fetch the photo of Alaric from the mantel?" I asked softly, my voice devoid of emotion. "I want to see his smile while we talk." The request was simple, a classic redirection technique I had perfected during my time in Norfolk. For exactly 3 seconds, her back was turned to me as she reached for the silver frame. In that window of time, I executed a seamless, silent swap of our cups. When she turned back, her smile was wider, more confident. I watched her take a long, triumphant sip from the safe cup with a sense of tragic finality. Forgiveness is not about letting toxic people back in. It is about acknowledging they no longer have the power to destroy who you have become. I took a slow sip from my own cup, the clean one, and looked her straight in the eye. The silence between us stretched, thick and suffocating. I realized then that my mother had officially crossed the line from a toxic parent to a criminal adversary. There is a specific kind of coldness that settles in your marrow when you realize your own blood would rather see you unconscious than see you free. Would you have shared that cup of tea? Or would you have seen the venom behind the smile? It's hard to admit when the person who gave you life becomes the one trying to steal it. 10 minutes passed in clinical stillness. Malvina leaned back in her chair, her eyes gleaming with predatory intent as she waited for my head to droop. When I remained perfectly alert, my posture as straight as a bayonet, her composure began to disintegrate. I leaned forward and began to recite a list of dates, the family's illegal offshore transaction records I had just pulled from Alaric's server. I watched her face pale, the honeyed mask cracking to reveal the rotting wood beneath. The flickering candlelight made her look like a stranger, a ghost of the mother I thought I knew. I set the cup down on the glass table with a hollow, decisive clink. "You didn't raise a daughter, Mother," I said, my voice as steady as a heartbeat. "You trained a soldier, and soldiers have a very specific protocol for dealing with poisoned wells." The desperation in her eyes turned to a frantic, sluggish panic as the sedative she had intended for me began to take hold of her own system. True wealth is a clear conscience. Everything else is just paper waiting to burn. My grandmother Eleanor used to say that, and looking at Malvina now, I knew she was the poorest person I had ever met. Aisha Pendleton was no longer a name that belonged to this house. The tether that had bound me to their dysfunction for 30 years was officially severed, not by my anger, but by their own hand. I stood up as Malvina began to stumble, her movements becoming heavy and uncoordinated. I felt a profound, surgical detachment. I wasn't happy about her fall, but I was done pretending I was responsible for catching her. That's where the finality of it all really sank in. I realized then that my family was desperate enough to commit a felony on their own blood just to maintain a lie. Suddenly, the heavy silence was shattered. The front gates of the estate were battered open with a sound like a thunderclap. The blue and red lights of federal vehicles cut through the conservatory glass, turning the exotic plants into a strobe-lit forest. Silas Thorne's voice boomed through a megaphone, rattling the porcelain cups on the table. "Pendleton Estate, stand down! Federal agents are on the perimeter!" I watched my mother collapse into the velvet armchair, her eyes rolling back as the heavy thud of federal boots echoed on the porch. The heavy thud of federal boots on the porch felt like the closing of one book and the violent opening of another. I stood in the driveway of the Pendleton Estate, the midnight air thick with a cloying mist that turned the rotating strobes of emergency vehicles into a frantic, disjointed kaleidoscope of red and blue. The raindrops drummed against the roof of a private ambulance parked near the fountain, a sound as steady and indifferent as a heartbeat. Looking back now, I should have seen the desperation in my mother's eyes as a warning that she was willing to burn the entire world just to keep me quiet. I didn't realize it then, but this was the moment they stopped trying to buy my silence and started trying to erase my existence. Malvina stepped out into the rain, shaking off the sluggish effects of the tea with a fury that made her look years older. She wasn't screaming. She was clutching a folder with a white-knuckled grip that suggested it was her last lifeline. "You think you've won because the power is out, Aisha?" she hissed, her voice a jagged blade cutting through the humid air. She pulled out a set of documents, a petition for involuntary commitment, and a series of forged military psychiatric evaluations. They claimed my stoic behavior, the very discipline that had kept me alive in the Navy, was a manifestation of PTSD-induced psychosis. According to the paper in her hand, I was a danger to myself and the family, a broken woman who needed to be contained. The trap snapped shut as a complicit private physician and 2 orderlies in clinical white uniforms stepped out from behind the ambulance. They moved toward me with a practiced, predatory caution. "I'm not hurting you, sweetheart," Malvina lied, her predatory smile curling with cloying poison. "I'm simply making sure you're safe until the court can appoint me as your legal guardian. We have to manage Alaric's burdens correctly." I stood perfectly still, my posture a rigid line against the mist. You can lock a person in a room, but you cannot imprison a mind that has already found its own compass. My mother thought she was saving the family, but she was merely trying to hide her theft in a padded cell. I didn't flinch. I didn't grant them the reaction of terror they so desperately craved. Instead, I analyzed the situation with the cold, intellectual detachment of a cryptologist. I noticed the inconsistencies in the forged paperwork immediately. The doctor's signature belonged to a clinic Sterling had heavily invested in only 6 months ago. The ink was too fresh, the logic too brittle. I wasn't panicked. I was documenting. Character is how you treat those who can do absolutely nothing for you, and my mother had just proven she viewed her own daughter as nothing more than an inconvenient asset to be liquidated. I knew then that the law was about to become a double-edged sword. The orderlies moved to restrain me, their hands reaching for my arms as Sterling and Cressida watched from the safety of the porch. Their faces were a grotesque mixture of fear and triumph. "Just give us the 12-digit key, Aisha," Sterling whispered, his voice trembling as he stepped into the rain. "Give us the access and maybe we can make this illness go away. We can go back to being a family." I looked at my brother with a gaze that made him flinch, a stare that stripped away his expensive suit and revealed the hollow coward beneath. "Integrity is not something you can trade for comfort, Sterling. You aren't fighting for a bank account. You're fighting against the reality that you are already obsolete." I thought of my grandfather Alaric's voice in that moment, a steady anchor in the storm of their greed. "When they try to make you small, Aisha, it is because they have realized how large you actually are." I refused to resist physically. I knew that every move I made would be documented by the doctor as aggression, another brick in the wall of their guardianship ambush. I simply watched the blue lights reflecting in the puddles, the rhythmic drumming of the rain providing a cinematic backdrop to their moral collapse. Have you ever stood in the center of a hurricane and felt nothing but peace? That's where it all started to shift. The sound of the rain was suddenly drowned out by the heavy, synchronized roar of multiple black SUVs approaching the estate gates. They didn't slow down. They moved with the aggressive precision of a tactical unit, their tires screaming against the wet asphalt. The estate's heavy iron gates were forced open with a metallic groan that echoed through the Georgetown hills. 3 armored vehicles swerved into the driveway, boxing in the ambulance and the private orderlies. The air in the driveway seemed to vanish, replaced by the crushing weight of real, official authority. This wasn't a family dispute anymore. This was a national security event. Silas Thorne, the director of the NSC, stepped out of the lead vehicle. He didn't look at the house or the ambulance or the terrified doctor. He walked directly toward me, his boots splashing through the water with the weight of a man who owned the ground he walked on. He stopped 3 feet away and offered a formal, crisp salute. "Lieutenant Aisha Pendleton, your 24-hour leave has been terminated. Your presence is required at the Situation Room immediately." The silence that followed was absolute. Malvina's petition fluttered in the wind, a useless scrap of paper against the sudden reality of my rank. Thorne turned his gaze toward the complicit doctor and my mother, his voice like grinding stones. "Director Thorne here. The person you are attempting to detain is currently operating under a Level 1 security clearance." He stepped into the doctor's personal space, his shadow looming over the man's white coat. Attempting to detain an active duty officer on forged documents during an ongoing national security investigation is a federal offense under the Espionage Act. Orderlies, stand down immediately or you will be treated as hostile actors. I watched the doctor's face drain of color, the white of his uniform matching the pallor of his cowardice. They had brought a knife to a nuclear standoff. I adjusted my jacket, the rain slicking my hair but my eyes burning with a new official light. I looked at my trembling mother, who was now clutching the ambulance door for support. "I didn't call for help because I was afraid of you, Mother," I said, my voice cutting through the mist like a siren. "I called for a witness. I wanted to ensure you finally saw the person you spent 30 years trying to ignore. You wanted to manage Alaric's legacy? Well, the legacy is standing right here, and it's no longer your property." I realized then that being seen by the world was my greatest defense, and my family's greatest fear. Looking back now, I realize that some silences are meant to be broken by a thunderclap. Thorne opened the door to the lead SUV, beckoning me inside. Before I stepped in, he handed me a tablet, the screen glowing with red-flagged wire transfers and encrypted logs from the Pendleton corporate accounts. "It's worse than the general predicted, Aisha," he said, his expression grim. "They didn't just steal from Alaric's foundation. They've been selling the country's trust to the highest bidder for years. This isn't just about a D-chuck anymore. It's about treason." I looked at the house one last time, the mansion I had grown up in, the house that had tried to erase me, and felt nothing but a cold, tactical fury. I stepped into the back of the SUV, the heavy, armored door thudding shut with a sound of finality that echoed through the Georgetown rain. It was a sound that signaled the end of my life as the Pendleton underdog, and the beginning of my role as their judge. As the convoy pulled away, I watched the estate lights shrinking in the rearview mirror, my family's desperate illusions fading into the mist. I didn't know what was waiting for me next, but I knew that I was finally operating on my own frequency. The darkness wasn't just my ally, it was my theater. I sat in the back seat, the quiet hum of the engine a soothing contrast to the screams I knew were currently erupting back at the foyer. I ran my fingertips over the red envelope in my pocket, the plastic slip with the QR code feeling like a cold, digital promise. I had spent my whole life trying to fit into their world, trying to be the daughter they wanted me to be. But Alaric had known the truth all along. He had trained me to be the one who would stand when everyone else fell. I realized then that my erasure by the family was actually my liberation. That's where the war really began. The hum of the armored SUV's engine was a low, steady vibration against my spine as Georgetown receded into a blur of rain-slicked asphalt. My military training had always taught me to keep a straight posture, but tonight, the weight of Alaric's secret felt like it was pressing me directly into the leather seat. I wasn't just a daughter being cast out anymore. I was a soldier who had finally found the right battlefield. Silas Thorne sat beside me, his face illuminated by the cold blue glow of a tablet, his silence more reassuring than any empty apology my mother could have offered. I realized then that my erasure by the family was actually my liberation. That's where the war really began. We arrived at the NSC headquarters just as the pre-dawn gray began to bleed into the horizon. The air inside the skiff was sterile, tasting of ozone and filtered ventilation, a sharp contrast to the suffocating scent of lilies and whiskey back at the Pendleton estate. Under the protection of Silas, I sat before a terminal, my fingers moving across the keyboard with the rhythmic precision of a concert pianist. Using the 12-digit key found in Rex's kennel, I bypassed layers of high-level encryption that Alaric had built as a final fortress for the truth. When the data was deciphered, the true purpose of Alaric's blank will finally appeared on the blue screen. It wasn't a bank account, it was administrative access to a multi-billion-dollar general trust, the Memorial Fund. This wasn't a fortune for luxury, it was soul care, dedicated to the rehabilitation of wounded veterans worldwide. My grandfather didn't give me a pile of money. He gave me a mission to protect the men and women the world had chosen to forget. I think of the sailors I served with in the Navy. We were taught that no one is left behind on the battlefield, yet my family spent decades leaving everyone behind on the books. My audit of the Foundation's history hit a massive wall of red flags almost immediately. Tracing the blockchain evidence, I watched as wire transfers totaling over $150 million moved from the trust into a network of shell companies in the Cayman Islands. Each transaction coincided with Sterling's disastrous real estate ventures. or Cressida's bloated charity galas. The moral impact hit me like a physical blow. They hadn't just ignored the veterans. They had actively preyed on them. The gluttonous ones weren't the daughter who shared bread with a dog, but the mother and siblings who had been feasting on the blood of heroes. Looking back now, I should have felt a sense of heartbreak, but all I felt was a cold, surgical steel hardening in my chest. I didn't cry for the family I had lost. I began to record the evidence, ensuring the legal foundation for their downfall was airtight. Greed is a hungry ghost. The more it eats, the more it starves. I wasn't there to take their money. I was there to return their victims' dignity. I realized then that some silences are meant to be broken by the cold, hard weight of a federal indictment. Have you ever realized that the people you were supposed to trust were the very ones poisoning the well? It changes the way you breathe. Just as I prepared to hand the compiled evidence over to the Attorney General, the silence of the Tsekif was shattered by a news alert on the peripheral monitors. My breath caught in my throat. Malvina and Sterling were holding a press conference in Georgetown, the cameras flashing as my mother played the role of the heartborn mother perfectly. They presented forged digital logs from my time in the Navy, claiming I was the one who authorized the fraudulent transfers to cover secret gambling debts. I watched her wipe away fake tears on national television, characterizing me as a mentally unstable traitor who used her military training to steal from the very people she served with. The media storm was instantaneous. Before I could even speak my truth, the world was being told I was a monster. Silas Thorne entered the room, his face grim, a shadow of genuine concern in his eyes. "Aisha, it's a public execution," he said, his voice dropping an octave. "The FBI has been ordered to execute a search warrant on your personal records." Malvina played the victim card perfectly. "Legally, you are now the primary suspect in a federal fraud case." I looked at the monitors, watching Sterling smirk behind my mother's shoulder. They thought they had used the light to blind me, but they had forgotten that I was trained to operate in the dark. I didn't panic. My heart didn't race. I leaned back in my comfortable chair, the ozone from the server suddenly feeling like the air before a lightning strike. They wanted a show? Then let them see the final act they'd been rehearsing. I realized I couldn't fight them with just the law anymore. I had to use the truth they feared most. I opened a hidden partition in Alaric's file labeled Protocol 49, his ultimate insurance against a corrupt family. This was the final battle, and I knew it was all or nothing. I watched the televised image of my mother's fake tears, a faint smile playing on my lips as I activated the file that would turn the Pendletons' perfect gala into a digital funeral for their lies. The world was about to see what happens when the mountain they tried to erase finally moves. If you've ever been blamed for the very thing you were trying to stop, you know the kind of fire that starts to burn in your soul. That fire was now my fuel. The transition from the sterile, ozone-tinged atmosphere of Skiff to the stifling, humid ambiance of the Pendleton Grand Gala felt like stepping through a portal between 2 centuries. I sat in the back seat of a black sedan, the Washington, D.C. streetlights reflecting off the tablet screen on my lap. I had activated Protocol 49, the digital hibernation cell my grandfather had buried in the family server years ago. It was a silent hammer, waiting for my signal. The gala was a sea of shimmering tuxedos and predatory smiles, held in a ballroom that smelled of lilies and old money. As I walked in, the air seemed to thin around me. Guests pulled away as if I were a contagion, their whispers fueled by the morning's orchestrated character assassination. I could hear the jagged edges of their judgment. "There she is," someone muttered behind a champagne flute. "The traitor daughter." I maintained my Navy posture, every step rhythmic and purposeful. I wasn't there to defend a ghost. I was there to move a mountain. A lie can travel halfway around the world while the truth is still putting on its boots. But when the truth arrives, it doesn't need to shout to be heard. Malvina stood on the mahogany stage, radiant in emerald silk, looking like the queen of a kingdom built on sand. She saw me and her smile curled with a cloying, triumphant poison. She adjusted the microphone, the feedback screeching for a split second before her voice filled the hall. "Look at her," she said, pointing a diamond-clad finger directly at me. "Aisha Pendleton, the gluttonous hippo, who gorged on the trust of our nation's veterans to hide her own failures. Tonight, we purged this house of her shadow. The room erupted in gasps and a ripple of mocking laughter that felt like shrapnel. I didn't flinch. I didn't shout. I stood in the center of the floor, a solitary silhouette of navy blue against their swirling silks. I remained silent because I knew Silas Thorne was already inside their digital backbone. I checked my watch. The countdown to the final strike was in single digits. Patience is the greatest weapon of a soldier. You let them think they've won until the very moment they've lost everything. I felt a strange, cold pity for Malvina. She was a captain who had spent her life rearranging deck chairs while the iceberg was already tearing through the hull. I realize now that honor isn't something a room gives you. It's something you carry until the world is finally forced to see it. That was the moment the tide officially turned. Just as Malvina signaled for security to drag me out, every television screen and digital projector in the hall, and every major news outlet across the country, flickered with a Tier 1 emergency override. The Pendleton branding vanished, replaced by the stark, unyielding seal of the President of the United States. The President appeared on the screens, speaking from the Oval Office with a gravity that sucked the air out of the room. "My fellow Americans," he began, his voice booming over the speakers. "Tonight we recognize a hero who operated in the shadows, Lieutenant Aisha Pendleton, whose cryptologic brilliance prevented a catastrophic threat to our national infrastructure. She didn't just protect our borders, she protected our soul." The shockwave was physical. The ballroom fell into a silence so profound you could hear the ice melting in the abandoned glasses. Malvina's microphone hit the floor with a dull thud, the feedback echoing like a dying animal. 400 of Washington's most powerful people turned their heads in slow motion, their gazes shifting from Aisha, the traitor, to Aisha, the hero, with a whiplash that was almost audible. Have you ever watched a room full of people realize they were mocking the person who was actually keeping them safe? It is a silence that speaks louder than any scream. I didn't gloat. I simply looked at my mother and spoke softly. "I didn't need a red envelope full of money, Mother. I just needed the truth you were too greedy to recognize." The heavy double doors of the ballroom were kicked open by federal agents in tactical uniforms. Silas Thorne led the group, striding past the stunned guests with a respectful nod toward me before encircling the stage. He ascended the podium, his voice carrying the cold, hard weight of federal law. "Malvina Pendleton, Sterling Pendleton, you are arrested for conspiracy to commit cyber fraud, embezzlement of federal veterans' funds, and obstruction of justice." Protocol 49 had unveiled the irrefutable evidence I had gathered, real-time logs, blockchain evidence, and signed confessions from associates of their shell company. The mask of the Pendleton dynasty didn't just fall, it shattered into 1,000 sharp shards. As Sterling was handcuffed, he began to weep, his expensive suit suddenly looking like a cheap costume. He looked at me, pleading with his eyes for a salvation I no longer owed him. "Aisha, please," he whimpered. I looked at him with a heart-wrenching sadness that was far more painful than anger. "I would have saved you, Sterling," I said, my voice steady as a heartbeat. "But you cannot save someone who has already chosen to drown in their own greed. I am not your enemy. Your choices are." In a final act of stoic grace, I asked Thorne to let Malvina walk out without handcuffs, preserving a shred of her dignity for the sake of Alaric's memory. She didn't look at me. She couldn't. As the Pendletons were led away into the flashing lights of the DC night, I stood alone on the stage, the center of an abandoned circus. The president's image on the screen faded, replaced by a final, hidden video file I had decrypted from Alaric's library. He was smiling, sitting in his favorite leather chair, looking directly into the lens. "Well done, Aisha," he whispered, his voice crackling with age and pride. "The foundation is yours now. Don't just protect the past. Build something that lasts." I stood in the center of the empty gala, the silence of the room heavier than the applause that had just died down. I turned my eyes toward the flickering screen, realizing that the final mission my grandfather had left for me was just beginning. The final flickering images of Alaric on the ballroom screen felt like a benediction, a signal that the long, dark night of the Pendleton secrets had finally yielded to the dawn. I stood in the center of the abandoned gala, the silence of the room heavier than the thunderous applause that had just died down. 1 month later, I found myself walking through the halls of the Georgetown estate again, but the air was different now. The cloying scent of lilies and predatory vanity had vanished, replaced by the honest, neutral smell of cardboard boxes and floor wax. The mansion was quiet, stripped of its predatory energy. Every luxury item, from the Dutch oils on the walls to the baccarat crystal, had been inventoried for asset forfeiture. It wasn't revenge, it was restitution. I realized then that a house built on the tears of others is nothing but a gilded tomb. Only a house built on service can truly be a home. Working alongside Silas Thorne and a team of federal auditors, I ensured that every stolen dollar was legally rerouted back to the Alaric Pendleton Remembrance Trust. We followed strict US 501 C3 regulations, building a financial fortress that was bulletproof against any future corruption. Despite the deep betrayal I had endured, I used my own Navy savings to ensure Malvina had a competent legal defense and a modest, safe place to stay while she awaited trial. I didn't do it out of a lingering need for her approval or out of weakness. I did it because of a stoic principle Alaric lived by. You must remain honorable, even when everyone else has lost their way. True power is the ability to show mercy without compromising justice. I am not erasing her crimes, Silas, I told Thorne as we signed the final papers. But I refused to let her bitterness dictate my character. The morning of the Foundation's inauguration was crisp and clear, the winter sun reflecting off the Potomac with a brilliant silver light. The guest list was no longer a collection of lobbyists and power-hungry socialites. It was 400 veterans and their families. I stood on the small stage and officially signed the documents that converted the Pendleton estate into a state-of-the-art rehabilitation and housing center for injured Navy personnel. During my speech, I shared a small memory of Alaric teaching me how to fix a broken compass when I was 10. I told the crowd, "A broken compass doesn't mean the North Star has moved. It just means you need a new way to find it." Today, we find our way back to honor. I caught sight of Cressida in the back of the crowd. She was wearing a simple, dark dress, her vanity stripped away by the reality of our family's fall. For the first time, she looked at me not with mockery, but with a dawning realization of my worth. I had offered her a job in the Foundation's kitchen. It wasn't an insult. It was an invitation to earn her own living and find a purpose beyond a mirror. Alaric had left me that empty red envelope because he knew I was the only one with the strength to tear down the family's rot and rebuild something holy. Happiness is not the absence of struggle, but the presence of purpose. I understood then that my value had never been something for my mother to grant or my siblings to acknowledge. It was a standard I set for myself. Later that afternoon, I drove to Arlington National Cemetery. The rows of white headstones shimmered like frost under the winter sun. I wore my navy dress whites, the fabric crisp and bright, my medals gleaming against my chest. I found Alaric's grave and stood there for a long time in the absolute reverent silence of heroes. I pulled a single red envelope from my pocket. This time it contained a simple letter stating that the mission was complete and the veterans were safe. I placed it on the cold marble headstone, a final report to the only man who truly saw me. I realized I no longer needed a seat at my family's table because I had built a table that could hold the world. Silas Thorne was waiting for me by the SUV near the cemetery gates. He leaned against the door, watching me with a respect that required no words. He offered me a position as a permanent liaison between the National Security Agency and the Veterans Administration, a role that would allow me to protect Alaric's legacy on a national scale. I looked back at the sprawling white field of Arlington, and then at Silas. I smiled, feeling the weight of the last few months finally lift from my shoulders. "Service never ends, Silas," I said, my voice steady and clear. "It only changes uniforms." The final cinematic shot would have captured me as a small, strong silhouette against the vast landscape of history. I saluted my grandfather's grave one last time, a crisp, professional movement that contained 30 years of unsaid gratitude. I turned and walked away from the camera, my stride purposeful and independent. The music in my head swelled into a triumphant, soulful finale as I stepped into the SUV. I was no longer the gluttonous hippo or the forgotten daughter. I was the architect of freedom. I took a deep breath of the cold winter air, feeling the weight of the red envelope finally lift from my heart. I was stepping into a future where my name was no longer a burden, but a beacon of the truth I had fought so hard to protect. If you've ever had to choose between your blood and your soul, you know that some honors are meant to be earned, not given. What is the one value you would never trade for a red envelope full of money? Tell me your truth below. I read every one.